Hi, folks, and welcome to Week 5 on the Reservations and the Extermination of the Buffalo, the 19th Century Great Plains. As usual, we have our list of learning objectives for the week. Let's get into it. Up until the mid 19th century, Indian tribes formed a solid wall across the enormous continental swath of land obtained by the U.S. from the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. Despite the U.S. having sovereign possession, at least on paper, indigenous polities still dominated much of this geopolitical zone during the first half of the 19th century. Even so, this was a region in flux, as colonial shatter zones had already sent shock waves ahead of American westward expansion. Already a century prior, the Western Sioux, aka the Lakotas, migrated from the woodlands of the western Great Lakes and upper Mississippi River and moved further west along the Missouri River, all the way up to the Black Hills, which we'll talk about later. They were pushed in this direction at least partly due to the reverberations of the 17th century Beaver Wars, although by the 18th and 19th centuries, it was these very same forces that drew them to the northern Great Plains, where they were able to exploit a power vacuum as sedentary tribes along the Missouri River had been hit by periodic waves of diseases, including the 1837 smallpox epidemic discussed last week regarding the Choctaw removal in the southern Great Plains. Recall how eastern and western tribes were compressed into the imaginary cartographical construct of Indian Territory, leading to violent intertribal conflicts. Thus, as native southern tribes were relocated to Indian Territory, the native Osage people were pushed northwards into the present-day state of Kansas, where the ever-shrinking settler colonial frontier caught up with them only 2 decades later. This was, after all, the era of manifest destiny, a term originally coined in the 1840s as part of the annexation debate over Texas. The newly independent Mexican government had originally invited white American settlers to move to Texas in order to populate this depressed and vulnerable frontier region threatened by the Comanches. But in 1836, the American settlers declared independence from Mexico. President Jackson initially recognized the Republic of Texas, although his successor knew that annexation would lead to war, which is what ultimately happened with the Mexican-American War, the results of which radically altered the geopolitical landscape of North America. More than half of Mexico was transferred to the United States, over 1 million square miles, in an audacious act of conquest. And this entire episode demonstrates how American settler colonialism expands through a potentially limitless self-constituting capacity. Settlers bring their sovereignty with them, relying on ancient sovereign claims inherited from the Old World to counterintuitively declare sovereign independence here in the New World. This is the ethos that makes an American, according to the classic take of the frontier thesis. And settlers on the frontier may be fiercely protective of their local claims to sovereignty, but they still nevertheless see this as a foundational sovereign entitlement that flows from their collective imagination as part of a single political community. Manifest Destiny was thus built on the Jeffersonian ideal of the United States' presumed responsibility to spread freedom around the world, beginning with the westward expansion across the continent. According to this dominant vision of American nationalism, the supposedly inevitable demise of the Indians was simply the price to pay for greatness, if the United States wanted to become a global power. Moreover, Americans simply couldn't resist what they thought of as, quote, free land. With this attitude, white Americans migrated in droves to Oregon and California in the 1840s and 50s, triggering new epicenters of colonial violence. Indian country was subsequently compressed from both the East and the West. Not to mention, Indian country was right in the middle of American policymakers and business leaders' plans for transcontinental railroads. But of course, Americans weren't just passing through. Settlers come to stay. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 thus established 2 large federal territories from what had previously been designated as the northern part of Indian Territory. Indian Territory was shrinking so quickly that the removal policy became obsolete by mid-century, as there was simply nowhere left to remove the Indians. As a result, American Indian policy began a monumental shift from exteriority to interiority. So let me explain. So, whereas prior to removal, the United States negotiated with Indian nations through the Protocols of Foreign Affairs, after removal, the American government began dealing with Indians as a matter of domestic policy. This shift was most evident in the bureaucratic reshuffling of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the federal government, when in 1849 it was transferred from the War Department to the newly created Department of the Interior. Pursuant to this push to domesticate the Indians, in 1851, Congress authorized the BIA's plan to establish Indian reservations in order to ensure rights of way for settlers. Concentrating Indians on reservations would also make it easier for the U.S. government to deliver annual annuity payments and other forms of compensation for land cessions. Historically, such payments came in the form of goods and merchandise, but over the course of the 19th century, annuities were typically delivered either as money or food. These annuity payments cemented the federal government's presumption of a fiduciary relationship over Native Americans, essentially forcing the latter to become permanent wards of the state, thereby giving the U.S. a powerful form of leverage. Such power dynamics were further evident with the changed meaning of reservations in American property law and Indian policy. So, prior to removal, Indian reservations were lands reserved by tribes for their continued use and occupancy when they ceded other lands to the U.S. So, as late as the 1780s and 90s, Indian cession treaties often included provisions for Indians to retain portions of their original treaties. These retentions were reservations. They were still owned by Indians. After removal, however, many relocated tribes now lived on reservations in a new sense of the term, land that the government had selected from its own land and reserved for the Indians' use. So there's a crucial difference here, insofar as the former reflected an exterior relationship vis-a-vis settlers and indigenous peoples, whereas the latter reflected a shift to an interior relationship. So whereas the former meaning of reservations ostensibly retains some degree of underlying indigenous sovereignty, thereby tacitly acknowledging an exterior relationship between the U.S. and autonomous independent tribal nations, the latter meaning of reservations, the one which continues to operate today, is fundamentally built on a relationship of interiority. In this latter sense, reservations are built on American, not Indian sovereignty. Native Americans have thus been quote-unquote given lands that are legally owned by the federal government. This new policy led to the expropriation of Indian territory at an unprecedented pace. According to Stuart Banner, it had taken whites 250 years to purchase the eastern half of the U.S., but as a result of these changes in American Indian policy, they needed less than 40 years for the western half. We'll see the mechanics of this a bit more next week when we discuss allotment, which entailed breaking up tribal lands into individual tracts based on fee simple property rights. Thus, like the removal policy before it, the reservations policy was beset by an inherent tension over what precisely it was supposed to accomplish. On the one hand, the more idealistic purpose of reservations was to keep settlers out, thereby following the humanitarian pretense of the removal policy. So if the Indians were doomed to extinction, according to this logic, then it would be benevolent to segregate them onto reservations, kind of like conservationists do with endangered wildlife. On the other hand, the political realism of the day determined that the Indians be concentrated on federal land reserves where permanent residency under strict federal control would be obligated. Thus, the true purpose for reservations was to secure the West and to safeguard settler colonial expansion. Before the transcontinental railways, settler migrants used overland routes, such as the famed Oregon Trail, which cut right through the homelands of many indigenous people, including the Lakota. Yet these trails were not long, narrow paths as much as they were broad highways, as wagon parties spread out looking for supplies and grazing lands for their hungry oxen, cattle, horses, and sheep. This massive invasion of peoples and livestock negatively impacted the grasslands that supported the enormous buffalo herds of the Great Plains, upon which relied plains people like the Lakota. Thus began a familiar cycle, as settler disruptions to indigenous ecologies and economies provoked retaliations, which in turn provoked counter-retaliations. Indigenous militants frequently demanded food and goods from passing wagons and sometimes stole or killed settler livestock. In response, settlers looked to the government for security. Yet, given the military prowess of the Plains tribes, the U.S. government wasn't about to conquer the region through force. Instead, the new reservations policy was supposed to solve the Indian problem more economically. Thus, following the 1851 Indian Appropriations Bill, federal commissioners convened a major gathering of the Plains tribes living between the Arkansas and Missouri rivers at Fort Laramie in the present-day state of Wyoming. The U.S. demanded unmolested rights-of-way for migrants and delineated reservation boundaries for each tribe. Now, although these boundaries cut into indigenous peoples' original homelands, they nevertheless provided a modicum of federal recognition and protection, at least in theory. In exchange for agreeing to move to reservations, the government promised the Indians that they wouldn't have to surrender their hunting lands either. They were also promised annual annuity payments. Yet, despite these guarantees, the terms of the treaty were nevertheless unfairly balanced. In particular, the Americans demanded that each tribe select a principal or head chief, despite the fact that these indigenous polities were not hierarchically organized in the fashion of modern states. Thus, the Sioux were supposed to designate a single leader, despite the fact that they are actually a confederation of three divisions, each of which are further broken down into two or more tribes. The three divisions from east to west, by the way, are the Dakota, the Yankton, and the Lakota. We'll be focusing on the Lakota, the westernmost Sioux, who are comprised of 7 tribes that historically were further broken down into bands, camps, and families, not too dissimilar from the sub-tribal clan organization we saw last week. Roughly speaking, from the mid to late 19th century, more moderate bands of Lakota were in the south and east, with more militant bands in the north. So, despite the fact that U.S. negotiators arbitrarily got a single Lakota leader to sign the 1851 treaty, there was no consensus as to how the Lakota should engage the Americans. Yet, during the 1850s, American Indian policy was overshadowed by the growing sectional crisis. The role of settler colonialism in fomenting the American Civil War is often overlooked at the expense of slavery as a cause, despite the fact that it was the expansion of slavery that precipitated disunion. Essentially, the Civil War was an ideological contest between two competing aspirations of American empire. Already in the first half of the 19th century, the Southern plantation complex had an insatiable appetite for new territories. The Confederacy had its own vision of manifest destiny, spreading all the way to the Pacific, even harboring dreams about taking over parts of Latin America, especially Cuba. The Free Soil movement vigorously opposed the expansion of slavery in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, and in the 1850s, it merged into the newly created Republican Party, whose platform for modernizing the West involved massive infrastructural investments and a serious commitment to opening up lands for independent farmers, such as with the 1862 Homestead Act, which offered 160-acre lots to settlers. It's that quote-unquote free land that we were talking about. It's also worth noting that the Republican Secretary of State under Lincoln and Johnson was a major proponent of American expansionism in the Pacific. Now, although the carnage and sheer destructiveness of the American Civil War is of course legendary, a current line of relevant scholarship explores how the brutalization of war fostered a culture of death, wherein transgressive violence became increasingly normalized. This was not only apparent in the massive casualties from the great battles in the eastern and western theaters of the war, but especially in the partisan warfare in the Trans-Mississippian Theater. And perhaps the most notorious incident there was the 1863 sacking of the pro-Union city of Lawrence, Kansas, by a rebel guerrilla outfit that massacred 180 civilians. In response to Confederate insurgents, the Union Army adopted a counterinsurgency strategy that destroyed the enemy's economic system and demoralized its civilian population. Now, to the extent that military force was deliberately used against civilian populations, this strategy did indeed embody some features of total war, a concept that was coined in the context of mid-20th century European warfare. But as Jeffrey Osler reminds us, the U.S. military didn't mass murder white Southern civilians the same way that it had long employed extirpative warfare against Native Americans. Now, that didn't stop pundits during the Civil War from employing the vocabulary of anti-Indianism against the supposed savagery of their domestic enemies. Unsurprisingly, this culture of death radically amplified anti-Indianism in the still geopolitically unsettled West, where the reservation policy was already coming apart, with the federal government reneging on its annual annuity payments due to wartime exigencies, leading indigenous militants to threaten settlers. This was the basic underlying dynamic between two of the worst episodes of anti-Indian violence during the 1860s. The first was the 1862 U.S.-Dakota War, which was precipitated by the Santee Sioux uprising against broken treaty promises. In a dramatic escalatory response, the governor of Minnesota declared before the state legislature that, quote, "the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state." This threat was backed up by the commanding officer of U.S. forces, who said, quote, "It is my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux if I have the power to do so." Now, if these explicit utterances of genocidal intent failed to materialize fully, then it was due more to indigenous resilience than American restraint. Even so, the consequences were deadly, particularly for the 38 Dakota men who were hung by the U.S. military under orders from President Lincoln. To this day, it remains the largest official execution in American history. Genocidal violence was less restrained in the second case, this in Colorado Territory, where the governor ordered all citizens, either individually or together, to kill and destroy hostile Indians, with the latter designation intentionally vague and open-ended. Months after this proclamation, a Methodist preacher turned army officer made good on his promise to, quote, kill and scalp all, big and little, with the November 1864 Sand Creek Massacre of a peaceful encampment of Arapaho and Cheyenne. In a particularly infamous addition to the lexicon of anti-Indianism, this perpetrator used a dehumanizing metaphor to rationalize murder, saying that nits make lice, thus comparing Indians to the eggs of parasitic insects. Mass death was thus becoming normalized in this especially violent era. In this context, the Sand Creek Massacre created further unrest in the Northern Plains. In 1865, federal negotiators convinced some moderate bands of Cheyennes and Arapahoes to forfeit their lands in Colorado and Kansas in exchange for a reservation in southern Indian Territory. Yet more militant bands traveled northward to seek refuge with their traditional Lakota allies. Meanwhile, settlers were no longer just passing through the Black Hills. They were staying, attracted by the opening of gold and silver mining operations in Montana and Wyoming. In response to this open violation of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, Lakota and Cheyenne militants harassed settlers, thereby compelling the U.S. military to install a series of forts surrounding Lakota territory. As noted, indigenous military prowess stymied American settler colonial ambitions, with U.S. military forces unable to defeat a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho militants under the command of Red Cloud, a famous Lakota war leader. His military success against the Americans led to a revised peace agreement with the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was yet another double-edged sword. On the one hand, it established the Great Sioux Reservation, including ownership of the Black Hills, and the Americans agreed to dismantle some of the recently constructed forts. On the other hand, although the treaty didn't entail further land cessions, the language of the agreement implied an inferior title for the Sioux. Furthermore, it asserted American sovereignty and biopower through the extension of criminal jurisdiction over Indians who threatened or harmed settlers. As we'll see, promises to respect reservation boundaries were quickly abandoned, and as a result of forces to be discussed next week, namely the allotment policy, the Great Sioux Reservation was subsequently broken up into this non-contiguous, checkerboard-like cartographical arrangement, a legacy of dispossession. In any case, all of these events garnered public attention back east, and ushered a debate over American Indian policy. It was really a debate over the means, not the ends. That Americans should expand westward was not the issue. Rather, it was once more a question of what to do with the Indians who were in the way. The territorial expansion was a national imperative after the Civil War, arguably helping to reconcile the North and South through the joint settler colonization of the West, as the frontier ethos enabled a common national identity to be rebuilt around the promises of economic opportunities and freedom. And moreover, it was widely agreed that the Indians were doomed to give way, one way or the other. It was just a matter of how. So we've already noted that in 1849, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was transferred from the War Department to the Interior Department. Yet as conflicts escalated in the Northern Plains, the War Department and its political supporters pushed to reclaim control over Indian affairs. Although the debate would last until the 1880s, the BIA remained as part of Interior, which is where it still is. This decision to keep it in Interior reflected the so-called peace policy initiated after the 1868 election of Ulysses S. Grant, the former commanding general of the Union Army, who had previously endorsed military rather than civilian control of Indian policy. Yet a November 1868 massacre by the 7th U.S. Cavalry against a peaceful group of Cheyenne, present-day Oklahoma, renewed the growing humanitarian critique of a military solution to the so-called Indian problem. Just before Grant's inauguration, a group of Quaker philanthropists met with President-elect Grant and convinced him to launch a public-private partnership in the government's administration of Indian affairs, with Christian reformers serving as Indian agents under the BIA. As we'll see next week, the cooperation between state and church played an important role in the origins and growth of the Indian residential schools. American Indian policy was thus caught in between what we might recognize as genocide and ethnocide. Like the civilization policy during the early republic, Grant's peace policy envisioned the cultural erasure of indigeneity as the cost of assimilation. But also like the civilization policy, a sort of Plan B remained an option, as the peace policy was backed up by the contingency of waging total war against any recalcitrant tribes who threatened to go off the reservation, a phrase whose original meaning denoted the reservation system's fundamentally carceral purpose, designed to lock in Indians in order to secure the West. The peace policy thus sought to solidify reservation boundaries and discipline native populations, as evidenced by this quote from President-elect Grant. In short, the policy meant that the federal government would remain at peace with all tribes who agreed to stay within the boundaries of the reservations, but would go to war with all who transgressed those borders. In an endnote to Osler's essay this week, we learned that the war aspect of Grant's so-called peace policy resulted in over 200 military actions against quote-unquote hostile tribes during his administration. This is another bit of anti-Indian nomenclature from the time, as quote-unquote hostile Indians was the open-ended designation for any Indians off the reservation without the government's permission. Hostile Indians thus fit into the savage slot, referring to a long-standing repertoire of text, images, and ideas about the supposed depravity of natives as the inverse of civilization. Additionally, this label reinforced dominant self-righteous cultural narratives of settler innocence that projected aggression onto any real or perceived form of indigenous resistance. Now, by the 1870s, the balance of power on the Great Plains was still up in the air, although not for long. The U.S. military may have had an overwhelming advantage in the form of its modern industrial complex, and although the railroad construction in the West portended the coming settler invasion, really this technological edge was effectively neutralized by geography, as the American military struggled to locate enemy positions in the immense vastness of a region better suited to the hit-and-run style of guerrilla warfare that leveraged the Plains warriors' legendary proficiency in horsemanship, endurance, tracking, scouting, and most fighting skills. In response to the tactical advantage of indigenous militants, the U.S. Army responded with innovative strategies that exploited the food-gathering economy of the semi-nomadic Plains tribes, who had no experience in winter warfare and no means of surviving a long war of attrition. The extermination of the buffalo was thus a deliberate strategy of socio-economic destruction that U.S. military commanders adopted from their Civil War experiences in waging a preliminary form of total warfare. Our readings thus illustrate how buffalo killing became a norm, a sort of unwritten rule that enjoyed widespread social sanction, despite the fact that it was never formally authorized by written orders. The Army hunted buffalo for sport, as well as to court political allies, while private buffalo hunters used new, large-caliber rifles with telescopic sights to harvest buffalo hides at staggering rates. Waging an unofficial war of attrition not only destroyed the Plains tribes' crucial food source, but it also undermined their entire lifeways, all in a deliberate attempt to force them onto reservations where their main hope of averting starvation was to depend on the government's annuity payments or the goodwill of missionaries, thereby further subjugating them to a permanent wardship status. Now, as hinted, the buffalo extermination was more than just attritional warfare. Our reading this week by Tasha Hubbard compels us to rethink our conceptual categories, particularly when it comes to the question of the genos, i.e., the group targeted for destruction. Now, her argument may seem like it's going too far, although we should at least pause to consider the inherited anthropocentric biases and predispositions of modern Western philosophy. Anthropocentrism is the belief that humans are the center of the ethical universe, and that we have a superior ontological position over the rest of nature. This belief goes back to ancient biblical pronouncements about man's dominion over nature. Interestingly, our use of the translated word dominion here goes back to the King James Version of the Bible, which, for context, was published only a few years after the founding of Jamestown, thereby providing a theological justification for settler colonialism. The etymology of dominion goes back even further to the ancient Latin word for lord or master of the house, providing deep ideological wellsprings for dominant 19th century colonial discourses pertaining to the aforementioned savage slot. Etymologically, the word savage means from the woods. Native peoples were thus seen as part of the natural landscape, either as passive objects that could be exploited and mastered, perhaps through some form of benevolent stewardship, or as wild brutes that needed to be permanently subdued. In this ideological climate, both Hubbard and Smits show how the Buffalo and the Plains Indians were imaginatively conflated as obstacles to American expansion, thereby setting up the utilitarian logic behind the buffalo extermination that we saw in the previous slide. Hubbard's analysis goes one step further, however, building on a key lesson from Donna Akers' reading from last week, as well as Andrew Wolford's introductory chapter from week 1. The key lesson from them is how a genos is constituted frames the way in which it suffers attempted group destruction. So rather than trying to analytically impose outside categories, such as the protected group identities in the Genocide Convention, we must understand how alternative ontologies of group life determines the form of genocide. To appreciate this point, we need the assistance of cultural relativism, a core methodological principle of anthropology. It means that cultures have their own particular and unique histories that aren't governed by universal laws or categories. We actually saw this basic idea last week with Aker's emic perspective of Choctaw group life and destruction, challenging our etic perspective as outsiders. A similar perspective is necessary for understanding how Hubbard rethinks the genos through an expanded conception of peoplehood as something more than the sum of its individual members, and instead encompassing language, sacred history, an attachment to a specific place or territory, and a people's ceremonial cycle. All of these factors are thoroughly interconnected and highly relational. For example, the story of the white buffalo calf woman is foundational to the sacred history of the Lakota. Basically, it tells the story of two young men who are out hunting when they encounter a beautiful sacred woman who had been sent by the Buffalo Nation to teach the Lakota their 7 sacred ceremonies. So, for the perspective of many Plains people like the Lakota, they see the Buffalo Nation as elder relatives. So, in a culturally relativistic and ontological sense, the Buffalo Nation is its own distinct genos. Thus, Hubbard's argument is that the buffalo themselves experienced genocide. Check out pages 299 and 300, where Hubbard describes the social impact of the buffalo slaughter and how the buffalo feel grief, denoting a level of impact that goes beyond the sheer magnitude of death rates, which, by the way, were massive. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of buffalo killed in the span of decades, in an exterminatory process that drove this keystone species to the brink of extinction. So whether or not you think the G word fits, this is definitely part of the conversation. But mind you, before moving on, the objective here is to apply the principle of cultural relativism to a rethinking of the genos. I'm not necessarily asking you to assess Hubbard's argument. First things first, we have to understand the argument before we can evaluate its merits. Before we get back to the history of the late 19th century American West, I want to stick with some conceptual issues, as our discussion this week only fits with a bit of stretching into the broader framework that we've been using over the past few weeks. So, the 3 parts of Article 1, Section 2 of the 1947 Secretariat Draft are synonymous with Lemkin's tripartite division of genocidal techniques. Now, I think this framework provides us with a broad descriptive rubric for identifying genocide, but our discussion this week doesn't really fit into any single category. So, for example, we've definitely seen these elements of physical genocide, and that's before we even get to Wounded Knee in the next slide. Surprisingly, the original category of biological genocide doesn't seem entirely relevant, at least not on the surface. I made this point last week about the critical omission of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as deportations. So, although I find enormous utility with the basic idea of biological genocide, that is, of interceding group reproduction, I think that the framers of the Genocide Convention were limited by historically contingent discursive structures. They just didn't have the thinking tools to articulate these other forms of group destruction. Now, as far as this week is concerned, I guess Part 2b concerning obstacles to marriage probably applies, given the restriction on movement imposed by the reservation system, but that may be a bit of a stretch. Likewise, despite the intuitive appeal of cultural genocide vis-a-vis the Buffalo genocide, there's nothing in the original language of the Secretariat draft that's entirely applicable. Again, not without some conceptual stretching, due to the fact that the framers of the convention weren't even thinking of other than human ontological relations. We thus return to the inherited problems of genocide, as our discussion this week challenges the overlapping tripartite conceptual framework used to outline our syllabus. Recall these screenshots from week 1, when I compared Patrick Wolf's typology of settler colonialism's 3 strategic phases with the 3 types of genocidal techniques. As noted then, this isn't a perfect analogy. As a heuristic device, these overlapping conceptual frameworks are artificial abstractions that help make sense of a messy world. They are epistemological tools, not ontological givens. They don't exist independently in the real world, at least not beyond our imaginations. In other words, the distinction between these categories isn't so clear-cut. For instance, our discussion this week of the reservations policy demonstrates all 3 of Wolf's strategic phases. It involves confrontation on the frontier between the settler society and state on the one hand, with independent indigenous peoples on the other. It obviously involved carceration, essentially locking up the Indians as a means of securitizing the West. And as we'll discuss next week, the reservations became sites of assimilation. So, in a way, the reservations were like the figurative doors that brought in formerly independent indigenous peoples from the exterior into the interior of the U.S. body politic. Similarly, a broad conception of the category of biological genocide, or at least broader than that originally conceived by Limkin and the Secretariat draft, not only centers our conception of genocide on reproduction, but it also provides a sort of analytical linchpin that relates the physical and biological categories of group life and destruction. The inseparability of physical, biological, and cultural genocide is evident in the Wounded Knee Massacre, which brings us back to our historical narrative. So, not long after the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, settlers from the Dakota and Wyoming territories began once again flooding the Black Hills looking for gold. Meanwhile, the Northern Pacific Railway planned on cutting right through unceded Sioux territories. In 1873, the U.S. Army launched an expedition into the Black Hills in order to monitor the Indians and protect settlers. This was followed 3 years later by a large-scale invasion of the Great Sioux Reservation. This was the context for the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which the famed Lakota warrior, Sitting Bull, led a combined Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho force to resoundingly defeat the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry in late June 1876, just weeks before the country's centennial celebration. Having thus embarrassingly failed to conquer the Indians by sword, the Americans turned to the pen, with Congress attaching a rider to the Indian Appropriations Act of 1876 that cut off all annuity payments and rations for the Lakota unless they ceased hostilities and ceded the Black Hills, nearly 23 million acres. This sell or starve strategy worked, and in 1877, the Lakota quote-unquote agreed to relinquish their claims. For the next decade, they were subjected to the broad assimilationist forces that we'll discuss next week, although this context is necessary for understanding the conditions that produced the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. In 1888 Nevada, a Paiute religious leader named Wovoka prophesied the mass resurrection of dead Indians, the return of the buffalo, and the removal of all the whites, thereby starting an indigenous revitalization movement that spread across the entire West, especially across the scattered Indian reservations on the Great Plains, where it gained many adherents amongst the more traditionalist elements of the Lakota. And despite the fact that Wovoka preached a doctrine of nonviolence, instead imploring followers to perform a special ceremony that the whites called the Ghost Dance, this movement triggered paranoid U.S. policymakers, both in the Department of the Interior and the War Department, who were inclined to see the Ghost Dance as a fanatical militaristic cult. The U.S. Army mobilized a massive show of force under the highly prejudicial and grossly exaggerated, even hallucinated fear that the ghost dancers would break out of the reservations and ignite a race war against white settlers. In actuality, according to Osler, the ghost dancers threatened the authority of the reservation system, not the lives of settlers. Nevertheless, in mid-December 1890, Indian Agency police killed Sitting Bull during a botched arrest, thereby setting off a chain of events that would culminate weeks later when, at daybreak on December 29th, the 7th Cavalry massacred some 300 Lakota, mostly women and children. Many were shot while trying to flee via a nearby ravine. Others were chased down and killed, some more than 3 miles from the scene of the massacre. Later that same day, a blizzard swept over the entire region, freezing the dead on the killing fields until they were thawed enough to be dumped into a mass grave. The struggle over knowledge, memory, and justice began immediately after the Wounded Knee Massacre, with the first written accounts framing the incident according to the savage slot. Journalists embedded with the 7th Cavalry sent reports via telegram to media outlets nationwide, painting a picture that would become part of the official U.S. government record. The Secretary of War thus falsely asserted that the incident was caused by a, quote, band of savage fanatics who had committed treachery by launching a surprise attack against the unsuspecting American troops. Such a story played into popular discourse at the time, as illustrated in our short primary source by the famous American author L. Frank Baum, who had migrated from New York and settled out west. Before he wrote The Wizard of Oz, we have these editorials of his that demonstrate just how extreme anti-Indianism had gotten at the time, at least out west. Once the 7th Cavalry was exonerated by an official investigation, the basic narrative of settler innocence was further cemented by public commemorations, funerals, and monuments for the dead American soldiers, who were mostly killed by friendly fire, by the way, along with the conferral of 20 Medals of Honor. Meanwhile, news of the massacre spread across the Lakota reservations, especially amongst those who had not joined the Ghost Dance. In response to their grievances, Congress appropriated some money to compensate quote-unquote friendly Lakotas who had lost property during the recent conflict. Yet this legislation explicitly excluded those who had lost the most, especially survivors, such as Joseph Horncloud, a teenager whose parents, 2 brothers, and a niece were massacred. Having acquired basic literacy skills from the mission schools, Horncloud was able to use his familiarity with the enemy's language to speak back to the colonizer, especially by inserting the keyword massacre into the discussion. Week 7, I'll return to the Lakota struggle for justice, but the final point here is that survivors of Wounded Knee took it upon themselves to establish their own culture of memory. This was enabled by the fact that the site itself was on the Pine Ridge Reservation, ensuring ease of access for the local survivor community. This began with Lakota mourning rituals immediately after the massacre, with the so-called memory sticks that community members dug into the ground to mark where their relatives had been killed. Joseph Horncloud also personally designed and funded the construction of a large granite monument to commemorate the Wounded Knee Massacre. As seen in this photograph, the monument was unveiled in a 1903 public ceremony attended by 5,000 Lakota, thereby creating a lasting structure that marks the enduring counter-memory that speaks back against settler narratives of innocence. Okay, and that's it. Usual discussion form assignment this week, right? And keep working on your final paper. Reach out to me, especially if you need help accessing sources. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.